This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from the Master Brewers Bookstore, where you can find must-have titles like the Practical Handbook for the Specialty Brewer, Beer Packaging, Conference Proceedings, and more. Visit mbaa.com/store to build your brewing library and make better beer.
Can't tell you how many times I'm near the bottom end of a keg at a place where I'm getting a beer and all I get is sludge. It's rather unpleasant, and it's one of the things that I don't think people want to have marked against their product.
You're starting to have Carrageenan denature as soon as you add it.
This is just another ingredient that gives you an opportunity for you to step back and look at things at a higher level and then continue to work your way into the process.
Happy spring, everyone. Today, my friends Andrew Fratianni and Mark Sammartino are here to drop a whole lot of knowledge to help you make better beer. You guys ready to get nerdy about seaweed?
I guess.
Who doesn't like to get nerdy about seaweed?
All right, cool. There are probably some brewers listening who either don't know or haven't thought about how Carrageenan, aka Irish moss, works. Before we get into lots of detail, let's first start off with that 30,000-foot overview version of how it works.
Okay, Carrageenan is a plant-based material. It's added to the kettle at the end of boil, and in a whirlpool, it will help to remove soluble proteins that would otherwise combine with polyphenols later on in the package and start to form chill haze. So it's a way to limit the onset of chill haze or reduce it in package. But it also helps in the whirlpool to form a more compact true pile, so you'll get more wort out of your brew. And it also helps to form cold break in the fermenter. So again, removing those proteins in the fermenter. That if you're filtering or even centrifuging, helps to reduce the load or the amount of proteins and solids that are removed in centrifuge or during filtration.
From a clarity standpoint, too, that these are the proteins that are going to fall out of suspension anyways. These are not the ones that are going to be picked up and used by yeast for digestion and their own structure, building, et cetera. But so it's a material that really needs to come out of the process in order to keep your fermentation aligned, as well as keeping your product from looking like it's got a sludgy bottom.
Tell us more about what happens after a brewer adds Carrageenan to wort. How and when does it start to work?
Once it's soluble, it's immediate. There's ionic bonding between the sulfates and the protein structure, and brings the two molecules closer together, as well as it goes into solution, the helix starts to form with the Carrageenan, so that creates the gel. So the introduction of the protein is rather rapid, as ionic bonding within the sulfates, as well as some hydrogen bonding in there. And then the gel formation is rather rapid. The key to some of this, actually, as well as is agitation. So depending upon how much agitation occurs after the gel formation, you may or may not get a good gel formation. As the bonding occurs, as I said, it's fairly rapid. If you're going in at high rates, or if you're just settling in a kettle, or if somebody actually mixes the whole process up, you may re-break some of that gel formation, and that's part of the ratio blending of the two types of Carrageenan in order to make sure that you have a good balance between the fragile Carrageenan and the more elastic Carrageenan to make sure that you have that gel formation set up rather nicely. But the longer it sits in that matrix, then you've got more potential for that to break, and you got more potential for the for the denaturing to occur, et cetera. So, back to your question, it's rather rapid, and from that point forward, it becomes less and less effective.
And I think also one other thing on how does it work? When you add the Carrageenan to the kettle, you have formation of random coils. And at some point, they're attaching to the protein, and then they aggregate and start to settle. So that's really the specifics on their function as far as we know it.
Stokes' law, larger particles.
Stokes' law, right.
We've already said that Carrageenan is seaweed, but it's not just any seaweed. Tell us more about what it is and where it comes from.
So it is originally, and it's commonly known as Irish moss. And if you think about it, it is part of the British brewing tradition. So they were most likely using local material that they had available to them. And we think local is only a new phenomenon. But the seaweed that they harvested has kappa, iota, and lambda Carrageenan in varying amounts. We as brewers and the industry have found that two plants, as Mark mentioned, grown in Southeast Asia, Eucuma cottoni and Eucuma spinosum, give almost pure kappa and iota Carrageenan. So lambda Carrageenan does have food applications, but not in brewing. So it's used in toothpaste, pudding, ice cream to give a creamy texture. It doesn't work well in brewing. So for brewers, we're fortunate that these two plants produce almost entirely kappa and iota Carrageenan. And that's what's used today for the brewing industry.
How about describing the process for producing Carrageenan? What needs to happen before it can be tossed in a brew kettle?
Well, it's harvested as it's grown, and then it's washed to try to reduce the organic matter that's in it. And then there's a form of extraction that will go on. And it can take place in two different directions, but typically it's a form of a caustic type washing process, and then some form of milling, and then beyond that you get into the higher level of concentration, which can happen with the use of calcium chloride or alcohol for the extraction of the Carrageenan from the seaweed. So you can either have semi-processed material or highly processed material. Once it's extracted, there's a gel processing, drying, milling, and then a blending for consistency. So it is a fairly industrial process once you go through the semi refined material to the refined material. But the advantages of that is you're getting a more concentrated form of the actual Carrageenan material that you need, and you have it blended to the specific ratios of those Carrageenans that you need for your process.
So you've got the more fragile version and the more resilient, elastic gel formation. That's from I forget. Is that which one is kappa is more fragile and iota is more elastic?
Yeah,
or the other
I have to look it up.
Okay,
I'd have to look it up, to be honest with you.
Kappa Carrageenan is a strong, brittle gel.
Okay,
and then with iota Carrageenan is a little bit more elastic. And usually you'll find that at least on the refined products, they're going to be a mixture of the two. And that's why a refined product is probably a little bit better use in brewing, because you know what's in there. If you're using other plant-based materials, they could have lambda in there too, or different ratios. And those ratios can change depending upon where they're harvested, what time of year, what kind of growing season it has been. So we have to keep in mind that this is an agricultural product, basically. But yeah, so it's a combination of the kappa Carrageenan and the iota Carrageenan that will give you a strong gel, but one that's somewhat elastic. And I think about it too, in a troop pile, in a whirlpool, it will hold together better, especially towards the end. As you start to get towards the very end of your cooling run and the whirlpool is just about empty, that troop pile starts to come apart sometimes. So I think the iota allows it gives it a little bit of resiliency, so it won't break apart in chunks.
Very good. Is there I assume I don't know, is Carrageenan harvested all year round, or is there also sort of a a crop year to Carrageenan, if you will?
I think it depends where you are. In the South Pacific, I think it's growing almost continuously. It's ideal climate for growing seaweed, and that's why most of the production globally has moved to the South Pacific. Just ideal growing conditions. Go ahead.
It brings up a good point, though, John, in that regard, that it's growing all the time. It's going to be exposed to different environmental conditions, and with those different environmental conditions, you get different ratios of the material within the seaweed. And so, the all natural processes, all great in some respects, but they also present themselves with opportunities so that the semi-processed material is more likely to vary in its overall ratios of the Carrageenan, and its performance is likely to vary. So using the processed Carrageenan allows the manufacturer to actually go back and check the ratios and make sure that the material stays fairly consistent, so that your checking of that process, your its performance within your processes and removing the proteins becomes more of a consistent and expected process, rather than something that you're going to have to keep tracking it and having a large variability to it.
I think also it's good to talk to your supplier about the Carrageenan supply. Where is it from? How often does it change? And the suppliers also will have guidelines for optimization trials.
Do we have any idea when Carrageenan was first used in brewing?
I've only come across, at least in the brewing literature, references back to the mid-1800s, but I think as for brewing applications, but as being plant-based and something that has been harvested for centuries, I'm sure the application goes back further than that. We just don't have a record, or I haven't come across anything specific to brewing.
Well, the information I've been able to dig up on it is that it's been around since about 600 BC in China. But from an Ireland standpoint, it's been around since about 400 AD. But it was used for gelatin preparation at that time. So I would assume sometime between the 400 AD and obviously the 1800s, when production of beer became more of an industrial process in Europe. That's where the material started to interface with the production of beer. I'm sure that the use of gelatin has been used for a long time in beer making processes as a form of reduction of protein. So somebody just decided, hey, this looks like an interesting application. Let's give it a shot. So if I had to guess, in beer production, probably someplace around the 1700s, where communication started to develop a little bit better and people started talking about things that might work.
Coming up,
it's part of that balance in brewing, trying to figure out what makes the best sense for you. Because the longer you hold it, it's not necessarily better for the process.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. The D-System Keg Valves Safety and QA webinars March 27th. District New England meets in Rhode Island April 6th. District Texas meets in Shreveport the weekend of April 6th. The third annual District Southeast Crawfish Boil is April 7th. I went last year and it was a ton of fun. The Master Brewers Board of Governors meets April 12th. District Carolinas meets at Holy City April 14th. The Master Brewers Brewery Packaging Course starts April 15th in Madison. District St. Louis meets April 19th at Four Hands Brewery. And the 57th District Caribbean Convention is April 19th through the 22nd in St. Lucia. View the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. brewer's wort must have the right ions and pH for Carrageenan to be effective. Talk about that.
Calcium, magnesium, potassium. It's ionic ratios that are very important in order to get the three-dimensional structure of Carrageenan in order to hold properly. In order for it to function properly, it needs to establish itself as a helical compound, and interlink compound to form the gelatin. If the ionic balance is not correct in the solution, your pH is too low. As an example, the helices will not form, and then the gelatin will not form. Typically, the right ratios of the calcium, potassium, magnesium will help in that process in order to set the helix up. So you need a pH somewhere in the 5 to 5.4, 5.7 range, not much below that, in order to get it to work.
I think the other point to keep in mind also is that potassium and magnesium normally are in sufficient quantities in the wort for the Carrageenan to work. And most brewers are also adding calcium. So there really should not be a problem that you do not have enough of these ions. And it is written that below pH of 4.5, you will not get a gel to set up. So I think for most brewers, if we're looking at 5.2, 5.4 at end of boil on the pH, there should be no problems there.
So how about the timing of Carrageenan additions? What's the goal there?
Normally, you want to add it about 10 to 20 minutes before the end of the boil. So it needs to be hot enough to dissolve, and usually anything above 60 C will allow it to dissolve. You don't want it in there too long, so you don't want to add too soon so that the Carrageenan completely denatures and is no longer effective. My guess is that you're starting to have Carrageenan denature as soon as you add it. So that's why timing is critical. You still want enough of the material active and able to function before it's completely denatured.
I think that's an interesting point because, a lot of craft brewers are having very long whirlpool stands because they are trying to extract aroma compounds and whatnot. Whereas I know, Mark, in your brewing history, I know AB's philosophy was to, minimize hot wort time as much as possible. They believe that, the shorter the processing time on the hot side, the higher the quality of the wort. What was a typical whirlpool stand time for you, Mark, in most of your career?
There wasn't one. What it boils down to is knockout at roughly 33 feet per second, and create the circular motion in the hot wort receiver. And as soon as knockout was complete, and the PLCs were able to make the switch, the draw to the wort coolers would start at the same time. So if you actually take a bunch of pepper, throw it into a glass, actually, and take a pencil or something and spin it, you'll see that the solids will go directly to the center rapidly. So if your knockout is coming in at a sufficient speed, the protein material will actually start to form the cone in the center of the hot wort receiver very rapidly. So it's not something that you need to worry about from a stand standpoint or extract standpoint. So it was just a matter of minutes. But as you say here with the craft brewers, in my old history, if I go all the way back to my first brewing time, we used to have 60-minute holds, and all of those can build dimethyl sulfides, ferulic acid issues, things of that nature. But again, and wort oxidation. But that's all built within the total profile of your product and whether or not it's important to your overall flavor. But from a craft brewer sitting and holding for 60 minutes, hour and a half, et cetera, is trying to get additional extraction of the hops. What you're going to find with the use of Carrageenan is the same thing with proteins. You're going to get a lot of resuspension of materials because of that denaturing process. When proteins coagulate, they basically collapse upon themselves. There is some ionic and hydrogen bonding that goes on. The same thing goes on with Carrageenan. There is some ionic bonds that are formed within the structure of Carrageenan with protein. But for the most part, it's really a hydrogen bonding process. And as heat continues to denature both the Carrageenan and the protein, you can get that process to actually separate. And not necessarily form a good gelatin characteristic. So on both ends of the fence, if you're having trouble with protein coagulation and you have long hot wort receiver holds, it's part of that balance in brewing, trying to figure out what makes the best sense for you. Because the longer you hold it, it's not necessarily better for the process.
Yeah, and especially if it's, I think, Andrew, you said it's going to solubilize above like 60 C or something, right?
Right.
Yeah, so it almost seems like maybe a lot of craft brewers should just be adding it in the whirlpool instead of in the kettle. I don't know.
It's a good point if you can get sufficient mixing. But go ahead.
Right. I was going to say that could be something to try. And I think also today with brewing, we're trying so many different methods, or at least that we think are new. It requires an understanding of the process and the ingredients and how they work, and looking at maybe making some changes to where they're applied and how to apply them. So whirlpool application certainly merits some trials to see if it's functioning. That also brings up an interesting point. There are two views in the literature. One is that I think a stronger view is that it's the Carrageenan application has benefits seen in the cold wort. So once the wort is in the fermenter is where you will see the greatest removal of protein. But there is literature out there that states that no, it in fact also works in the whirlpool. So again, it's I think we have a lot of generalities, but for each process, because they're specific to each brewery and the raw materials, with a good understanding, I think brewers can do some trials and see what works best.
Okay, so it sounds like you guys are in the camp of that it's probably helping on with both hot and cold break formation?
Absolutely. But again, it's process driven. So as Andrew mentioned, your specific process, your specific ratios, what protein levels you're using in your particular materials, all play into that. If you're holding long hot wort receiver holds versus cold, shorter periods of time, if you've got a lot of European materials in there with low protein ratios, low modifications, you may or may not have significant issues. If you have very high modified materials, as in the United States, you can have greater protein issues, et cetera. So it's a trial and error process for your particular brewery. Nothing seems to be cut in stone anymore, as Andrew pointed out. There's a lot of variation in the processes. It's really a matter of stepping back, looking at the whole picture of what are you trying to achieve, and then deal with it in that manner.
Beyond reducing chill haze, what are some other potential benefits that might come from using Carrageenan?
The proper protein balance in your entire process is important. And it really, again, goes down to what you're trying to achieve within your process. So if you have too much cold break in your fermenter, you can actually interfere with your yeast performance by blinding the yeast's ability to pull in nutrients into the cell. So you can end up with some difficulty with fermentation. At the same time, that could end up manifesting itself as longer fermentations, less complete fermentations, higher byproducts, diacetyl, things of that nature, acetaldehyde. At the same time, getting the proper protein ratios in your finished product helps clarity, whether you centrifuge, whether you filter. Those large molecular compounds can interfere with the actual activity of a centrifuge or blind a filter system rather rapidly, and then you get into that character of how does the beer actually hold up in the package, whether that's in a bottle, can, or even in draft. I can't tell you how many times I'm near the bottom end of a keg at a place where I'm getting a beer and all I get is sludge. It's rather unpleasant, and it's one of the things that I don't think people want to have marked against their product, but it happens a lot. In its use because
you're saying you're emptying
what's
the
that,
keg
sir?
a lot of. You're saying that you're the
yes, I am emptying the keg.
You're the last one there emptying the keg. Okay.
Yes, I am.
Getting the bottom of the barrel. Yeah.
Okay. But you got to understand too, you're not dealing with protein's not protein. It's protein in this particular case, in this particular size, is the material that you want out of your process. It's not the protein that you want for good foam head support, for good nutrition for yeast, etc. This is the stuff that it really will cause a lot of hassle for you in trying to make a nice, drinkable, clean, non-mouth coating product. So using something like Carrageenan is an excellent way to get a good balance in the overall protein profile.
I think also, again, higher yield. If you have a nice, good, compact true pile in the whirlpool, you're going to get more wort out on that brew, and it's going to be a brighter wort going into your fermenter.
Okay, Andrew, just like we talked about with isinglass back on episode 75, brewers need to run optimization trials for Carrageenan as well. Let's describe a Carrageenan optimization trial. How does that differ from the isinglass optimization process we talked about before?
It's quite similar, in fact. So you would make up a stock solution with your Carrageenan and take some hot wort and dose at different amounts. Say you'll take probably 5 different samples of wort, dose your Carrageenan and cool it down. And then you can measure the amount of trub formed in each. And then you can find which one is the optimum dose rate for that particular wort stream. But also keeping in mind that this is not something you do one time, check it off, and forget about it. You should do this at least once a year when you have a new malt coming in. So each year is a new harvest of barley. You have new malt coming in. So that's probably a good time to do the optimization trials again, and with each different wort stream in your brewery. So I think that's probably a good guideline.
With any raw material, whether it be malt, whether it be the use of corn or a variety of hops, etc., you should try to do it with your eyes open. Try to gather as much information as you can. There's a huge amount of information on the MBAA website, in both the blogs as well as the TQ. Offers a great deal of depth. If you can't find it there are other resources, great technical books that are available for you to purchase. And I would recommend that if you don't have a few in your library, you get a few in your library and you ask these questions before you actually jump in. None of this should be done with your eyes closed. Everything should be done in your process, thinking your way through what is the chemistry, what is the process going to take place, what do I need to be careful with, and then try to make sure that you understand the consequences of everything that you do. So in the case of Carrageenan, if you're settling in a kettle and using your kettle as your hot wort receiver, it's not going to have the same type of trub pile that it would have if you're moving it to another vessel at a high rate of speed. If you disturb that pile, are you sending more and more material forward into your fermenter? How does that going to impact your fermentation, et cetera, in your process? So you have to kind of think your way through everything. This is just another ingredient that gives you an opportunity for you to step back and look at things at a higher level and then continue to work your way into the process.
Awesome.
I think also what comes to mind is a saying Michael Lewis had, and that's what do I see in front of me, and how does that relate to what I know? So just as Mark said, look at your process and think about what you're seeing and what you're trying to do and the tools you have and how they function, all keeping in mind what your goal is in the process.
That was Andrew Fratianni and Mark Sammartino here on the Master Brewers Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Carrageenan, check out their article in the Master Brewers Technical Quarterly. You can get there from the Publications tab or by typing Fining into the industry's best search bar at mbaa.com. 130 years ago, Master Brewers was built on the concept of brewers helping each other out so we could all make the best possible beer. That's still true to this day, and it's where a lot of the camaraderie in this industry originated. Master Brewers' award-winning Ask the Brewmasters is the best place to go for troubleshooting, where you'll find the industry's only discussion forum that's moderated for technical accuracy by a team of experts. See what everyone else is talking about at community.mbaa.com.
Maybe 2 things that you should have known, maybe 3 things that I should have